Hello, everyone. Today we are going to be continuing with the Civil War, and we're going to kind of leave battles behind for a little bit, and we're going to take a little detour and talk about politics and the people involved in the war. So let's go ahead and get started. So during times of war, it is a typical trend for the government to increase their power. This is true for the Union government and the Confederacy. So let's talk about some specific ways they did this. First of all, in April of 1861, Abraham Lincoln, president at the time, suspended the writ of habeas corpus between D.C. and Philadelphia. This gave military authorities the necessary power to silence people who were dissenters or people against the war effort and rebels. So under this order, commanders could arrest and detain individuals who were deemed threatening to military operations. So they could be arrested and they could be held without an arraignment. So previously, if you were under arrest, you had to be brought before a judge or into court, but that was suspended during this time because this was seen as an extreme measure, as an extreme time. So then there was also the creation of the draft, and the draft in itself is a selection by either like drawing of persons or whatever have you from the general group of people for military service. And so the Draft Act of 1863, this was the first instance of compulsory or required service in the federal military service. So you have males between the ages of 20 and 45 were at risk of being drafted. Then there was also an income tax. And so this was in August of 1861. You have the first federal income tax that was signed by Abraham Lincoln. And so the country was strapped for cash, period. And to pursue the war effort, you had Lincoln and Congress, they both agreed a 3% tax on incomes annually over $800. So with the Emancipation Proclamation, you had right after Antietam, after the Battle of Antietam, which was on September 17th, by September 22nd, you have a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This declared that as of January 1st, 1863, all slaves in the rebellious states shall be thenceforward and forever free. That's a direct quote. So it was an important turning point in the war. It transformed the fight from preserving the Union, which was what Lincoln had said for years, to a battle for human freedom. So the proclamation itself exempted the border slave states and all or parts of 3 Confederate states controlled by the Union Army on the grounds that these areas were not in rebellion against the United States. So Lincoln had earlier tried to persuade the border states to accept gradual emancipation with compensation to slave owners from the federal government, but they had refused. So the proclamation also authorized with the recruitment of free slaves and free African Americans as Union soldiers during the next 2.5 years. 180,000 of them fought in the Army. And also in the Navy, you had some there too, making a vital contribution to the eventual victory of the Union. So in the end, it makes the war about slavery. You have a higher purpose here. And then this also makes it to where the British are not going to want to keep helping the South. They are not going to keep trading with them and such. Okay, so you had some issues in the North. You had this group called Copperheads. Unlike it's not referring to the scary snake from this area. These were Northern Democrats that were opposed to the war. So this was a group of people that there were a large number of them actually that were arrested for harming the war effort. And a lot of them during the time that were arrested, they were part of that group that their habeas corpus had been suspended. There also were these draft riots. And so after the draft, you had a lot of wealthy people that could pay money to have substitutes fight on their behalf. And so poor whites, people who did not have money, no exemptions, they were angry. And so you start to see people start to riot, and they start to set things on fire, and just a lot of anger in general. Okay, so in the South, there were a lot of ways that the Southerners did suffer, because a lot of the battles, the majority of them, are in the South. Their land was searched over for food and supplies. We'll talk about Sherman's March to the Sea, where a lot of land was destroyed, things were burned, and it was just bad for a lot of Southerners. There were food shortages for this same reason. If soldiers would come through searching for food, they would take what they could find. People from the other side would scavenge. And so you had a lot of issues there. And so women that were left behind, they would take up the positions of men who had normally been farming and running plantations. Women were left to take care of these things. And so you have all kinds of issues here. Not a lot of food to go around. You have the issue of inflation, which is the increase in prices, but a fall in the purchasing value of money. So this, combined with the lack of food and the other issues they're already having, was detrimental to Southerners. So by 1862, Congress eventually allows African Americans to join the Union Army. You have some former slaves, whether by escape or by being freed, they are fighting in the war effort. They are paid less than white soldiers, and they are in segregated units. The military is not going to be integrated until right after World War II, with Harry Truman making that call. So if they were captured by the Confederacy, they could be re-enslaved. They could be killed. So this was a major risk for them. The 54th Massachusetts, this is the most famous unit. It's not the first of those segregated units, but it is the most famous. So they were a volunteer regiment, and their members became known for their bravery and how fierce they were on the battlefield against Confederate forces. Lincoln argued from the beginning of the war that Union forces were not fighting to end slavery, but to prevent the dissolution of the Union. But for abolitionists, ending slavery was the reason for the war, and they argued that African Americans should be able to join the fight for freedom. So to lead the 54th Massachusetts, the governor of Massachusetts chose a very young white officer named Robert Gould Shaw, and you'll see him depicted and the 54th Massachusetts in the movie Glory, if you've never seen it. And so he was from a wealthy family. They were prominent activists that were abolitionists. In the end, for Shaw, they lost a key battle at Fort Wagner. There were two there, but he lost the key battle at Fort Wagner. He was killed. He was only 25 years old whenever he was killed. And so what ended up happening was, while they lost at this specific battle, they did a great deal of damage. And so Confederate troops actually ended up abandoning the fort shortly after. And so for the next 2 years, the regiment was a part of very successful operations in Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. So in general, at war, soldiers' lives were very difficult. It was tough to get supplies. It was tough to get adequate food for the amount of people, good food to where they could be strong enough. And it was tough to have a well-balanced diet. Their clothing at times was very damaged, and it was tough to have good medical care. You did have a lot of amputations because the medicine just wasn't there yet, and unfortunately, they didn't have the manpower to provide proper medical care. Infection was prevalent because, unfortunately, with the minié ball, you would have bone being shattered, and then parts of the minié ball would be stuck in people's bodies. And so the easiest way to solve the problem was with amputations. And after that, you would see infection set in. But as time goes on, they figure out more and more about sanitation. So you have Clara Barton, which is actually, she's an extremely important force within the medical care unit during the Civil War. She's known as the Angel of the Battlefield. She was a pioneering American nurse. She risked her life to bring supplies and support to soldiers in the field. And she actually, like, nursing education, it wasn't very formalized. So she did not attend nursing school, but she provided self-taught nursing care. And so she herself founded the Red Cross. And people call her the Angel of the Battlefield because she was so helpful, and she could also bring comfort to soldiers and supplies, and her expertise. They also had prisoner of war camps, and they had awful conditions there. So you have Andersonville, which is also known as Camp Sumter. This was a Confederate prisoner of war camp. This was only during like the last less than a year and a half of the Civil War. It was overcrowded, first of all, by like 4 times over its capacity. They didn't have enough water. They didn't have enough food. It was unsanitary. People were getting dysentery, diarrhea, scurvy, which, if you know anything about scurvy, it is a consequence of a vitamin C deficiency because people were not eating enough fresh fruit and vegetables. And so, out of the approximate 45,000 Union prisoners at Camp Sumter, or Andersonville as it's called, out of 45,000, about 13,000 died. That is a large number. And so the inhumane conditions led to a high mortality rate of these detainees. And they're actually the commander of the stockade in this camp. His name was Henry Wurz. He was Swiss, but he was an officer in the Confederate Army, and he actually was tried and executed for the things going on at these prisoner of war camps. There were some in the north. I mean, there were prisoner of war camps all over, and they were terrible. People were treated horribly and starved to death. Just awful, awful things. Disease was rampant, bad. And so, because of all of these things that we've spoken about, there is this sense of disillusionment. People are feeling down about the war effort. You still have those strikes and that labor unrest. And the South is suffering. It is being crippled. Their physical structure is going to be crippled even more with the March to the Sea, which we'll talk about later. But their farming economy is being crippled as well. But the Northern economy is going to be growing. All right, so that is it for today's notes. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.